on digitalization and impact on workers, which is being co-organized by Public Services International, IT for Change, Third World Network, and Focus on the Global South, where I work. I'm speaking to you from New Delhi, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I assume there are some new participants who probably did not attend the last session, and also to ensure that there's a sense of continuity in the series, we thought it would be useful to have a quick recap of session one, which focused on digitalization and implications for industrial relations and labor law. I thought we had a very good session, but I think it'll be good for us to get a quick summary of that first webinar. So I would request Susanna from PSI to do that quick summary, and then we can get started with the second edition. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm so sorry we had a little interruption on this side. Okay. So it's a pleasure to see everyone here again and to have also new people. So a very short summary of what we discussed 2 weeks ago. So we had a webinar that was in a very engaged discussion on digital trade rules and industrial relations. We spoke about how platform workers are at the forefront of the more advanced impacts of digitalization, where they are facing both new forms of work, but also new ways in which employers are using data, algorithms, and these kind of tools of digitalization to control workers, to control the power over workers. We spoke about how this is impacting working conditions, including, for instance, how calculations of wages and incentives get manipulated through keeping algorithms opaque and manipulating the algorithms that calculate wage, or even the time that is required for a worker to work. All of this can get manipulated through those tools. We saw that while we assimilate these things with situations that are faced by occupations like Ola drivers or Swiggy delivery, there are many other occupations that are seeing changes that are coming with digitalization. And one example that we spoke about is work from home, which is giving an excuse to companies to monitor keyboard strokes, keeping surveillance of workers through that, which can be done with work from home, but can then be brought back to the office too. We also heard the example of Amazon workers, which are given wearables to monitor and also reduce their productivity, even when they're in the field. And these are things that are affecting many, could be affecting many other categories of workers. We spoke about the lack of regulation in the previous labor laws, as well as in the new codes, to address issues that are coming with digitalization in a comprehensive way. We heard a very interesting test about in order to assess if a worker is a self-employee or if a worker is actually in an employee-employee relationship, that was used in the state of California, and we documented this, and it's going to be part of the summary. So there are different things going around the world where in the same kind of situation there is a moving forward of regulations. And we noted that we need to have regulations of workers who are facing digitalization at the national level as well as at the global level, for instance, through ILO that needs to also create new standards for this, but that it is not only about regulation of labor in digitalization. We also need to have data governance that is regulated at the national level and at the global level, which is done in the public interest, not left for companies to have the control that they want on data and digitalization, and noted that unfortunately, the main discussion about regulation of digitalization at the global level is taking place in the World Trade Organization or in free trade agreements, which is really not where they should happen, and they are happening with the wrong intent of keeping the status quo of the power of corporations and not trying to bring them under scrutiny and ensuring regulation in the public interest. So this is a very short gist of what happened last time, and we hope to take this discussion forward. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Susanna. I think some of the issues that you just mentioned around data, algorithms, regulation, global governance, and the role of the WTO, FTAs, and how that's not the appropriate platform will come up in this sort of session as well. And before I ask the speakers to begin, let me just make some quick introductory comments to set the context for this edition of our webinar series, which is focused on digitalization, trade rules, and privatization. And in that context, the implication for workers in public services. And when we talk about public services, which is the sector where all of you work in, you should recognize that we are talking about some of the biggest markets in the world. And public services have been pried open through deregulation for large private corporations. In many ways, you have, and we are facing that challenge in our country as we speak with the massive privatization agenda of this government. So it could be outright privatization, it could be PPPs, it could be divestment of government holdings. And today, what we're going to hear about from our three speakers is about how the phenomenon of digitization is now a powerful driver for the privatization and expansion of corporate power in public services. Now, when we say digitization, what do we mean by that? So this is about the increasing role of information technology, of artificial intelligence, what machine learning, big data, in virtually all sectors of the economy, and the resultant impact it's having on workers, on consumers, and the economy in general. And the fact that we are having such a seminar online through Zoom is also an example of digitization and how it has enabled tens of thousands of meetings to happen concurrently across the world in the past months because of the pandemic. And the tremendous growth of digitization has also led to the creation of some of the world's largest and most powerful companies in a very short while. And just to give you a sense of how powerful they are, as of September 2020, the combined value of just the 4 big digital companies in the world, and all of you know about them, these are Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. The combined valuation of these just 4 companies is more than $5 trillion. 1 trillion is 70 lakh crores, and the whole of the Indian economy is only $3.2 trillion worth. So, and as we continue our, shift towards online, commerce, communications, these firms are going to become far more powerful, will be interwoven into our economies, and will surely have a huge impact on public services. And as all of you know, PSI has been in the forefront of struggles against privatization.
Server down hai kya apna?
Therefore, if we want to we have to fight the digital big tech corporations as well. So in this webinar, we will learn more about how that is happening in 3 important arenas. So we have 3 speakers. Jammu Anand from the Nagpur Municipal Employees Union will speak about the Smart Cities project. Deepika Joshi from Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, which is a people's health movement, will speak about digitization in health and its links with privatization. And our third speaker is Ranja Sen Gupta who is with the Global Research Group, the Third World Network, and she will address the issue of trade agreements, especially the WTO and various FTAs, and how that will entrench the power of tech corporations and therefore allow for the expansion of the private sector. So just to give the speakers a sense, you will all get around 12 minutes for your first intervention. And like we did last time, we can have one or two clarificatory questions to each speaker. And towards the end, we can sort of open up for comments, questions, and discussion. So let's start with Jammu. You know, Jammu, the Smart Cities project was announced in 2015 by Prime Minister Modi with his usual fanfare. But, you know, 5 years down the line, what is the record of the Smart Cities project and why should we be concerned about it from the view of digitalization and privatization? How will it undermine public services and workers? So Jammu, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Benny, Susana, and Brother Kanan, and all others who are part of the panel, as well as those who are listening and watching. This is very interesting and very important issue to, I think, understand when we look at urban governance and its impact on employees and workers. I will just put some bullet points, then I will go in little details. See, urban governance has taken, in a sense, since 2005, entirely a new shift. When JNN URM mission was introduced, where first time the local bodies were defined in a new, with a new perception. Cities were defined with a new perception, with a new definition, in which for the first time in urban governance, special purpose vehicles were introduced. For the first time in the urban governance, this cost recovery mechanism was introduced. And after 10 years, the extension of NURM is being manifested in the form of Smart City Mission. I consider this Smart City Mission is continuation of, the model which was introduced in the year 2005 in the form of NURM. Now, what is the shift between the two missions, NURM and Smart City Mission? NURM SPVs were introduced on services, the services which the ULBs used to offer to a particular city and the cities. It may be water, it may be transportation, it may be many areas, like it may be sanitation, waste disposal, and all those things. So during NURM regime, we have found that SPVs were, created, formed under companies law on the services. So the local bodies used to, in a way, transfer the services to the SPVs, and user charges were introduced. Now in NURM, a Smart City Mission, the SPV is being created on ADB, that is called Area Based Development. Means the developments which will be taken up on land. So portion of a city land area, parts of the city land areas will be brought under SPV. And here the SPV will be for entire city. And therefore, under Smart City, the present government brought 20 cities first, then 20 city, then 20 city. So the cities which are being brought under smart city mission, SPVs were created in the name of, uh, for example, Nagpur, it is called Nagpur Sustainable and Smart City Corporation, registered under Companies Act. So every city you will find these things. And from environment regime itself, the whole discussion about paperless administration of governance. But in doing so, many measures were introduced, whereas this uh, day-to-day administration should come out of papers. So online mechanisms were introduced, servers were put in local bodies, connecting all departments with that server. But during that period, when paperless administration was discussed, but still you find uh, employees in the department, employees actually sitting on the chairs, and both way you will find the employees were face to face. And now outsourcing was also in urban governance, was a byproduct of NURM, in which the functionings of the ULBs have been systematically outsourced to companies. Privatization, for that matter, in urban local bodies existed since long, because urban bodies, have to function multiple responsibilities. So, like civil work, all the civil work is to be accomplished by private contractors. But there were contractualization of workforce was taking place in urban local bodies for last 20 years. But the departments and controlling authorities were, of course, the local bodies. Now, what is happening in smart city mission is basically the entire urban local body, which is a public institution, is being replaced by company. So this is the major shift which is taking place in uh, smart city mission, and the whole smart city mission has come um, under the garb of digitalization. It may be various form of digitalization like surveillance system, and the whole surveillance system, both for detecting crimes and as well as to man their own employees, whether they are working or not. Particularly, the surveillance system was introduced in sanitation department. In many of the cities, if I'm not wrong, these uh, watches are being put on the rest of the sanitary workers, so that from the control room, which is located somewhere in the main office of the urban local body, from there you can control, from there you can man whether a particular sanitary worker is on the duty or not. So surveillance system in the smart city introduced with four objectives, and these objectives are very much common in any of the city, like they call as a vision of evolving into an eco-friendly education city that connects governments, business, people, and space electronically to create a clean, green, safe, prosperous, and inclusive ecosystem. And to attain these objectives, almost every city under smart city comes out with 7 different components. One component is a very important and basic component that they call as city network backbone. Then they come out with city Wi-Fi, city surveillance, city kiosk, smart strip, then command control center for surveillance, along with server room and help desk. And seventh is city operations center, along with server room, network operation center, and help desk. These are the seven, different interventions are carried under smart city mission by the SPV. Now, when as a trade union, I look into these things, how it impacts the workforce or the employees. Now, the local bodies or government public bodies where the services are are managed by some service rules, conduct rules, where the employees come under various conduct rules, service rules, and standing orders. But under smart city, being these functions are carried out by private companies, so all these service rules, all these conduct rules becomes redundant, meaningless, because these service rules are not applicable to private companies. Therefore, what is happening is, under public
म्हणून ह्याच्यामुळे
hello,
म्हणून खाजगी लोकांकडून
hello. So what happens is, there is a set procedure of employment for employment in public institutions. You have to maintain reservation, you have to give advertisement, you have to create a selection committee, you have to publish the list of selected candidates, and then you get into the services, and then you will find the increments, then you will find other allowances, then you will come out with scales, then you come out with pay commissions, then you come out with various social securities which are there for permanent employees, like GPF, like pension, like health, house rent. These are many things which comes for the employees of a public institution. Then retirement, then post-retirement benefits. Then for permanent employees, punishment, actions, suspensions, terminations, all those things have to be under the scrutiny of either standing orders or under the municipal acts. In Maharashtra, if an employee is terminated of an urban local body,
येत आहे कारण
the chairman of the standing committee under the municipal act has a right where a terminated employee can make an appeal, and the standing committee chairman has a right as power to withhold.
त्यामुळे खरं बघायला पाहिजे की प्रमोशन कुणाला मिळते, कशा
Rules are there. Now all these conditions in public institutions were hard earned rights by the trade union movement of last 100 years. Now what is happening is, a special purpose vehicle created by the local body, which is responsible for various developmental works, through digitalization mechanism, tools, being it is a company, all these laws, all these service rules, all these standing orders are not applicable there. So therefore, a company, how many manpower a company which will get the order for operation and maintenance, there is no cap. How that company will employ the employees, there is no procedure. And being it is a company, whoever joins that company is governed by ID Act, whereby hire and fire is a set norm. The question is, for a company, it is absolutely, it's a private company, therefore reservation in job is not a mandatory for a private company. Promotion policy, by law, there is no such law which dictates the company about promotions. It is the board of directors, as and when they feel, they can come out their own promotion policies. There is no salary.
काय असायला पाहिजेत हे बघणं पण गरजेचं आहे.
Class 4, class 3, class 2, class 1. There is a salary structure, scale structure is there. In companies.
If I can request you to wrap up in a minute, sorry.
Yeah. So what is happening here is, like I said, in outsourcing, still there were employees working on both the sides. But now in digitalization and smart city, majority work is to be accomplished by various artificial intelligence equipments, where the other side of the man is machine. So today what is happening is, all those responsibilities, services, which earlier the local bodies used to perform through their employees, those services are now being shifted to these artificial intelligence equipments under the garb of digitalization, by which manpower has almost come down. Only you will find manpower in the control rooms, but the money spent on that is more than the money spent by the public bodies on the salaries, incentives, and post-retirement benefits. So these are the things which are happening in digitalization, smart city, whereby all these service rules, service conduct rules are become meaningless, redundant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamu. I think that was a brilliant exposition in terms of charting out the reform process in urban local bodies and how they're being hollowed out in terms of their capacity. And the twin challenges, one of course is privatization and outsourcing and the creation of SPVs. But then the added challenge now that you articulate, which is of digitalization and how that is enabling, surveillance of workers, and with the toxic link with privatization, how it is undermining, long, fought and won basic labor rights. And I think you made that interesting link with the labor codes as well. But I think there are lots of areas where we can elaborate on this, because urban bodies is a huge arena of work. And I'm sure from the experience of workers and unions in the session, you will probably get a few questions to maybe elaborate or clarify. So let's open it up for a couple of questions and clarifications where I think you could elaborate more.
Yeah.
Continue. Please, let's
I would like, I would
questions.
love to take some questions.
Yes, please, the people who want to ask questions, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah,
Yes,
Yeah, I'm
please.
audible. Hello, Jammu sir. How are you?
fine.
Thank you everyone for giving me an opportunity to speak out today. Regarding the topic of privatization and associated digitalization with that, I would like to state that the development or the concept of having smart cities was something that maybe have been like an apple or a pie in the sky. They should have at least initiated these kind of programs with an experimental level or at a pilot level where we would have increased credibility of mission. When uh, a survey has been done for a simple thing as toilets availability in India, it has been observed that 30% still in India households do not have these facilities at the end, out of which 12% sewage network is only available, where only 3% post sewage treatment plants are available. They should have selected proposals which would have equally addressed economic challenges, infrastructural problems, and a decent life for all inhabitants. Now, it should also would have given a promise for a prospective growth, giving sustainable solutions while preserving environment as well as culture. But as now the plane has already taken off, I wanted to know that whether this SPV, that is the special purpose vehicle, or the urban governance, can it be controlled or held under any kind of legal framework? Thank you.
Shall I respond or shall I take more questions?
Yeah, maybe let's take one or two more questions and you can bunch them together. Anyone else, please? Yes, please, Nargis. You'll have to unmute your.
Hello.
You'll have. I saw Nargis's hand up, and then I think Manoj Kumar as well. Can we have Nargis ask the question first?
Yes, thank you, brother, for your nice presentation. But I have one question. The smart city mission. You mentioned smart city mission. The South Asia country now going from March to lockdown system, and the public sector workers maximum have loses their service, and they are when private sector workers are going to outsourcing, and outsourcing, how they will get the operated as existing gender equalities in the smart city mission.
Thank you for that question. I
Yes.
would also request the people asking questions to just introduce so people know who you are. Your name is visible, but if you can just mention your union and where you're from. Nargis, can you do that, please?
Hello.
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 Yes, please.
brother.
Okay.
Hello. Hello. I'm Manoj Doshi from National Organization of Government Employees affiliated to NOGE. Jammuji, this privatization is taking place everywhere nowadays. Contractualization of government services, service to the public. Is there any reason that some of the services are not given properly to the public, and public is not also satisfied with the government services and they opt for the private? Is that the angle? Thank you.
Thank you. So Jammu, if you can quickly respond to all three, and then we can move to the next speaker.
Yeah. Very interesting questions, Ken. See, first thing, what as a trade union should matter us is, do we believe that we want public bodies to remain or not? See, urban local bodies are not only public bodies, it is basically a constitutional bodies, because Indian political system, in which three-layer governance system is there: central, state, and local bodies. So these are the constitutional bodies. Now the question is whether we want these constitutional bodies to remain or to go. Second question is, who should take, or who are taking away the role and place? In other words, constitutional bodies are being replaced by the companies. So what is happening? Happening is the rights and roles of the public representative is being shrunk now, because the areas in which these SPVs will be functioning under ADB, area based development, there the elected representative has no role to play, because it's a company jurisdiction. So in a company, it is the directors who take the decisions, and in the local body, it is a democratic constitutional institution where elected representatives are there. So the role of the elected representative and the role of the public body is systematically being shrunk. Another aspect of it is the right of the citizens. Right of the citizen under public body is, it is a people's body. So every taxpayer, a citizen, has a direct access in that public body. But in company, the citizens are not the shareholders of the company. Citizens are not the directors of the company. No director represents the citizens. So therefore, the right of the citizens, taxpayers, to the access to public body is being completely taken away under this corporation. Now the question of, this is the old argument that public body with inferior services, privatization with better, superior services. What is our experiences? Experience world over showed that any public service or services which are being privatized and handed over to corporate entities, two things happen. One, the services, the quality of services has come down even as compared to the services when they were provided by the public body. Take transportation, take electricity, take water, take sanitation, what not. You see, this is the system under globalization. A case is systematically built for privatization. And what is the case built? Case is built that public bodies are incompetent. Public bodies are unaccountable to the people. And when a case is built, people at large also feel whoever may provide service, they want good service. So systematically a ground is prepared, privatization takes place. Then after 5 years, 10 years of privatization, then people realize two things they realize. One, the cost of service has increased by manyfold and quality of service has come down manyfold. But by that time, the whole public sector system vanishes. So therefore, as trade unions, we should not be under guilt that the public bodies are incompetent bodies. On the contrary, we should say public bodies are more competent. They can provide better quality services provided you spend on public bodies. Today, under NURM, even smart city, the money which is spent on O&M, operation and maintenance, is huge. It's huge. One has to look into that. 50% of the money spent on O&M on the private entities, if that 50% is given to public bodies, the public bodies can be strengthened. As a result, quality of services will improve. And mind it, under private sector, the exploitation of workers is very ruthless, where the same work which is performed, where sixth pay commission or say seventh pay commission the employees or the workers get, here only minimum wages they get, 1/4. So the services becomes 3/4 dearer, and wages to the workers under SPVs reduces to 1/4 only. So it is complete exploitation and of workers at one hand, and loot of the taxpayers on the other hand. So therefore, there is no connection between quality public services and privatization. On the contrary, privatization means poor quality of services and loot of citizens, exploitation of workers.
Jammu, do you want to address any other question? Because you mostly answered the last question. If you want to take the question from Nargis and the first.
Yeah, the first question, you see,
briefly though,
we cannot, yes, you see, we cannot have a selective approach. We as a trade union have to look in a perspective. Because when we look into selectively, then we land in a mode of making suggestions, some corrective suggestions, and that is a trap. See, basic principles of NURM, what was that? Basic principle, which was defined. Under NURM, local bodies was defined, saying that these bodies will now onwards will be playing a role of facilitators, not providers. So this is the fundamental paradigm shift brought in urban governance, where the local bodies from providers to facilitators. And then the cities defined in NURM, for the first time a new definition is come. What that definition was, cities were defined as saying the economic growth, engines of economic growth. Cities are defined as engines of economic growth. Therefore, cities have to build in such a way which will attract investment, both local, internal and external. Earlier, cities were defined as best places for habitation. But under NURM, first time cities are being redefined, saying that cities are engines of economic growth and centers of investment. So if these are the fundamentals of NURM, then whatever programs comes under NURM, there is no point suggesting in corrective measures in that. We as a trade unions have to be careful on that. What happened in Smart City mission? Under Smart City, they never talked about services. What they said about is to create eco-friendly cities. What is this eco-friendly cities? As far as pro-smart city governments are concerned, if you go to the models and modules of the smart city, where they say digitalization, creating surveillance, establishing kiosks. What the kiosks will do, it will you make a card and you can avail all the services which a local body used to provide, like death and birth certificate. You can go and clear your water dues, property dues. You can come out with your caste certificates. You can come out with your railway tickets. You can even pay your electricity bills in a machine. See, the question is ecosystem, eco-cities. This needs to be challenged and this needs to be understood. What does it means? Is eco-cities means handovering the entire city at the helm of few corporate entities, or does it mean that common man will own the city? So these are the fundamental things. And I would like to draw the attention is ultimately the public bodies are systematically being weakened. Systematically they want to in a way wind up the local bodies. There will be local bodies without any functions, without any rights. You know, under NURM, what happened? All the octroi system was withdrawn and a new tax system was introduced, which was called as local body tax. But this local body tax was with the state government. What happened? Every month, the municipal commissioner used to visit the mantralayas with a bowl, saying, "Please remit my share." And by the smart city came, LBT system abolished and GST system introduced. What happened? Today, all these chief ministers go in the Delhi capital with a bowl seeking, "Please remit our share." In doing so, what happened is the backbone of the local bodies, that was their own revenue system, was taken away. And once the independent revenue system of the local bodies have been taken away, the local bodies become dependent on the state governments for the revenue. The moment state government's revenue system, that was LBT, was taken away, the state governments became dependent before the central government. So therefore, this is a mechanism, this is a model in which the public bodies are being made practically of no entity, and whole urban governance is being shifted to the corporate private companies. So urban governance, yeah, this is what I would like to put this shift towards since 2005 from NURM to smart city.
Yeah, thank you, Jamo. I think you've, articulated how urban local bodies are both politically and financially being emasculated and therefore paving the way for big private actors to come in. And your point about how there's enough evidence that privatization is a failure in terms of quality, efficiency, costs, and unions should be advocating for quality public services and accountability. Thank you. I see that there are more questions for you, but I think we'll have to hold it there. I see Mansi Kanitkar's hand raised. I would request her to come back after the other two speakers have made their inputs as well. So I will call upon you, Mansi, in a bit to make your intervention as well. Let's move to the next speaker, who is Deepika. Deepika, thanks for joining us. And given your work at the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, can you elaborate a bit on the digitalization plans of the government of India in the health sector, especially with the recent introduction of the national sort of digital health mission and its links with privatization of health, especially from a worker's perspective? I'm assuming there'll be a lot of commonalities with the points that Jammu made. So Deepika, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Benny. Good evening to everybody. I am Deepika. As you said, there are quite a few commonalities, and I think the last bit of my presentation will focus on that. I am going to talk about what is the current government's recent plans about digitization in the health sector, and which has suddenly come into light because of the two recent policies which have been introduced in August. it's been some 5-6 years that this government has been intensifying the entire program and project of digitizing health and healthcare services. And but then the two documents that came in August, one was on 15th August, which was announced by the PM in his Independence Day speech, National Digital Health Mission, in which he talked about the health ID. And second is the document that was put in public for consultation on 26th August, which is the health data management policy. Now, looking together these two documents, they sort of build a framework and a structure for how the plans for digitalization in the health sector are going to be. So yeah, that is one. So this is the backdrop, and it has been there for some 5-6 years, but then it has become more aggressive in last say 2-3 years, especially after the national health stack was introduced in 2017. Now this is the backdrop. What do these two documents say? What is digitization of health? The plan is such that the idea is such that every data related to your health will be put up on internet. It will be put up on a server on a cloud. So that is what basically the idea around digitization of health is. When you as a patient go to the hospital, you have entry slip, you have a prescription, you have diagnostics, you have discharge slip, etc. All of that, instead of paper records, you will have it in the form of in digital format, which it can be stored on internet. That is one. All your clinical encounters as a patient, as an individual, will be stored up there in the internet. Second, there will be repository of all the doctors. There will be a database of all the doctors. There will be database of all the hospitals that are there. So this is more or less what the government is currently planning to do. Now, digitalization in itself is not bad. We have had some level of digitalization earlier. We have had processes when the sub-health center next to in your village, or the PHC in your block, or the CHC in your block would send up certain data. They would record certain data and put it and give it, and it would be collated. It would be sent to the CMHO, district health authority, and it would be used. So it was in a way useful for record keeping, for transparency, to make certain patterns. Where do you have more pneumonia? Where do you have more malaria? Where do you have more institutional delivery, etc. So in itself, there is no harm with digitalization when it is brought in with the purpose of improving your public health services. But what we are currently seeing with these two policies, and if you read these documents and the kind of urgency that is being shown by the government, it doesn't bode very well for the healthcare sector, the public health sector in general, especially, and the idea of healthcare as a right and health services as essential. Now, what do these two policy documents say? Some 2-3 things I will focus on, and then I will go on to the my last bit about privatization. The documents say that to be part of the digital health ecosystem, you need a health ID. And these documents say that it is not compulsory. You have a choice. It is voluntary. You can not be part of the health ecosystem. That is one. But on the other hand, these same documents will say that all the government services and programs will be made part of the digital health ecosystem, which essentially means that I, as a citizen, or I as an individual, not even a citizen, I as an individual doesn't have a choice to opt to not be part of the digital health ecosystem. I will have to get my health ID made because I want to avail these other government schemes and programs, which will be merged with the digital health ecosystem. So these documents give us, an idea of choice. It's your choice. It's voluntary. You can opt in the system, but actually they do not provide you choice. It is, and we saw the same thing in the case of Aadhaar, where they made Aadhaar voluntary and they said it is a choice, but especially the poorest people, they were forced to opt into the Aadhaar system because they would not get their ration unless they had an Aadhaar, or they would not get their pension or Manrega wages because of Aadhaar. So one idea is this, how eventually this is a forced thing where today or tomorrow you will have to opt into the entire digital health ecosystem, and there's no running away from it. Two, what if I am not part of this digital health ecosystem? Does it mean that I do not get services? I mean, is this your idea of health, where you see that you can only avail health services if you opt into a certain health database that government wants you to opt in? Do I not get health services otherwise? Second, let us say I am not eligible for a health ID. I am a refugee, I am a migrant, and I may not have an health ID. Do I then not get health services? And clearly you do not, because that is the kind of vision and imagination that these schemes are brought in, these health ID schemes are brought in. So that is the first part. Again, if you read these two policy documents, the sense you get is, it seems the policy documents are brought in to simply digitalize all your health data, simply to put all your paperwork out there in the internet for a certain purpose. What is the purpose of collecting so much data? What is the purpose of collecting the plans to collect the data of a billion population? There is no vision to show that how are you planning to use it for public health purposes? How are you planning to use it for surveillance in the sense of disease surveillance? How are you planning to use to assess mortality, morbidity, the traditional public health functions that we have had? There is no such mention. So eventually one feels that this kind of collecting data for the sake of it, one, it is clearly going to, the immediate benefit will be to the IT sector companies who will get huge contracts to manage the health database of a billion population. So we saw that in Aadhaar when so many software companies, it was seen as a revival for the IT sector, the coming in of Aadhaar. So that is the immediate benefit. And also your telecom companies, your mobile companies, and insurance companies. Such kind of individual health data, imagine if I go to a hospital and all my relevant clinical encounters for next 2-3 days will be stored in an internet server, which could be accessed by different entities. How useful it is going to be for insurance companies who will exactly have an idea which packages to offer me, what premiums to be made, whether to refuse a certain package to me because based on my health history. And this is not a theoretical proposition. It is very much possible, and we have seen that has been done earlier. One is this, how the insurance companies are going to use your health data, because the more data they have, the better they are able to predict what kind of packages are best for you. And let us say at some point of time, these data could be linked to other databases. So Aadhaar, for example, to which health ID will be linked, one of the ID that the health ID will be linked to is Aadhaar. Let's say if it is linked to your salary or the kind of food habits or food patterns that the company can predict. And these are not theoretical propositions. These are already the plans that government have to have a 360-degree kind of understanding of an individual, where the more data you have, the better these insurance companies can predict what kind of packages and premiums should be offered to you based on the profits based on the most amount of profit that they themselves can make. So that is second. Third is, apart from that, the companies which will be managing your health data will be managing a lot of health data. And apart from individual data, one can make certain prediction. This kind of bulk data is very useful in terms of research, and how we have no idea how this will be capitalized and how it will be used, and especially given that our country currently doesn't have any data protection law. So why is these policies being brought in when there is no any data protection law mechanism put in place? We saw that in case of Aadhaar also, how Aadhaar was being made mandatory even when the Aadhaar Act was not passed. So even if you read the news headlines today, I was talking about insurance companies, etc., and how it's going to benefit the software companies. They talk about how it's a $200 billion investment for companies, or $200 billion opportunity that these policies will have. Eventually, it seems like these policies are being made to help these certain sectors. So one of our colleague Usha says that when you look at policies, you look where are the people in it. But when today we see these policies, we can't look where are the people in it. You can clearly see who is it benefiting. It is not benefiting the people, but certain other entities. How do these digitization? How does digitization promotes privatization? One clear aspect is contracting in. So governments do not have the technical capacity to maintain such huge databases on their own. So they will outsource it or contract in private huge tech companies to do it on their own. So that is one way where that is one way of the entry of a private health sector towards a public sector kind of management. So that is one. Second would be the vision of these digitization processes. They do not come from a primary healthcare approach. Just the way I said earlier, when you look at these documents, there's a lot of focus on how there's no focus on how people are going to benefit. Similar, and it's not surprising because their approach doesn't come from a primary care approach to health, where primary care approach, we mean it's not just how your sub health center or CHC is going to provide you services. It is also about gender-based violence. Health system should also deal with caste-based violence. They should also deal with eviction and tribal rights, etc. But there is no such understanding, and it's not surprising because where will this understanding come from? Because eventually it seems that these policies have been kept not with citizens in their mind, rather certain corporates. Third, if these processes are expensive, digitization is an expensive processes. We have seen that Indian government over the years has had very limited budget. They have been not able to go above 1% of GDP to allocate for health budget. And if so much of cost is going to take by the digitization processes, it is very likely that there are going to be cuts in the public health sector, which will also be an eventual consequence of the previous point I made, where your approach is not of primary healthcare. And this slashing of public health sector will eventually mean that you will not do more public hiring, or you will do more contractual hiring, or you will not put money in your medicines, etc., or you will things like that. Fourth, and the second last point would be the public revenue. I think the next speaker is going to talk more about it, how these tech companies are known to evade taxes. So when, despite giving all these services within a certain country, there is no public revenue come in. It is of inevitable consequence that less money will be put in public sector in general, health sector in general, but in other public sector services also. So that would mean less revenue for the government, which would mean less allocation for public services. And I think the eventual point is that how the last point that I would make is how, and which I also made earlier, is how what is the vision behind bringing these digitization processes? It is not coming from an understanding of health as a right, or health as health as something to increase equity. It is coming, or even not even in terms of putting health money in public sector, or recruiting more doctors or more nurses. It eventually comes from an understanding that health is a commodity out there in the market, which can be used for profit making, and which can be capitalized to for more and more profits. And this is exactly what one understands when you read these two policy documents, where there is absolutely, in any case, there has been over the years and after the 1990s and 80s, no focus on public. In fact, there has been a gradual diminishing of public health sector over the last 2-3 decades. But these bringing in such policies strengthens our understanding, that strengthens our strengthens our worries that this government is very much there's not much focus towards the primary healthcare or public sector in general. So yeah, I think I'll end with that we as movements and we as unions really need to figure out how to oppose such policies, critique such policies, be cautious about them, and also understand the kind of effect they are going to have on us in terms of people who use health services or our public health sector. And yeah, I think that's how I'll end. Yeah.
Thank you, Deepika. I think the main point that you underlined was that there's this massive plan with the government to digitize all health data, but there's no articulation of the public purpose behind that. And you argue that all of this is rather to benefit large corporations in IT, insurance, and telecom, and the public funds that will then be, siphoned off to them, with obvious implications for investment in public health. And therefore, you made that link with the state of workers and possible hiring, which I think is very evident during the pandemic, that you need to have far more public health workers, and you need to be paying them better and ensuring better work conditions. But I think you also highlighted the important point about the public interest role of data, and that the phenomenon of digitization need not necessarily be a bad thing. It should be public data with the government to be used in the public interest. So thank you very much for making those points. Can we have any clarifications, responses to Deepika's intervention?
Sir, I want to have one clarification.
Yes, please. Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Bulu Ghotakurta from Kolkata. So I want to know, is Ayushman Bharat allocation anyway related to this health data? आयुष्मान भारत गवर्नमेंट का जो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट का जो प्लान है ना, is that anyway related to this health data or health ID?
Let's get a few more questions, Deepika, before you answer. Let's see if anyone else wants to ask anything. Mansi wanted to ask a question earlier. Do you want to ask a question, Mansi? I see Mohan Raj as well. If Mansi doesn't want, can I request Brother Mohan Raj to ask? Is Brother Mohan Raj asking a question, or we can move to Mansi? Mansi, can you ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Yes. Good evening all. I'm Mansi Kanetkar, woman representative, Mumbai Mahanagarpalika.
Please speak a bit louder, please, Mansi. We can't hear you.
Yes, I'm Mansi Kanetkar, woman representative, Mumbai Mahanagarpalika Karmachari Mahasangh. That Jammuji and Deepika ma'am has given a lot of valuable information about privatization and medical services and health services. But I want to say something about privatization. If we have to prevent this privatization and to safeguard the interest Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. If we want to stop this privatization or prevent this privatization and safeguard the interests of our workers at large, can we take any steps for increased efficiency in public sector by quick decision-making process, by delegation of power and advancement of digitalization in public sector? And secondly, can we develop work ethics among government employees by arranging frequently workshops and seminars on work ethics for employees in public service government organizations? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sister Mansi. Can we have Brother Mohan Raj please introduce yourself and ask your question? You were trying to ask something, I think. Please go ahead. Yes, please. Brother Mohan Raj, please introduce yourself and ask your question. Sir, can you ask your question, Mr. Mohan Raj? I'm not sure if he's trying to ask a question. Maybe we can get Deepika to respond to those two questions.
The first question is Ayushman Bharat related to Health ID. I can understand the importance that it may have for most of the people in our country, where with slow dismantling of all public services, that seems to be the only way out for people to get any decent health services, and possibly even in the private sector. So people happen to depend on it quite a bit. So yeah, there is all the chance that Ayushman Bharat will be linked to the Health ID, because the 2017 document that I earlier talked about, the National Health Stack, that was actually made for the purpose of Ayushman Bharat and clearing your claims fast and efficiently, etc., etc. The later documents talk about Ayushman Bharat, but also other many services. So there is a very, very high possibility that you will have to get a digital health ID or get into the digital health ecosystem to be able to avail Ayushman Bharat services. And I doubt if there is any getting out of it. How can we increase efficiency? The second question was, how can we increase efficiency in public sector through better work ethics, quick decision making, advancement of digital sector? So I think first we need to also ask that where is that idea of ours? I think it's related to an earlier question that Jammuji was asked, that public sector is inefficient, and he answered it very well, that why are we made to think that way? And let us say if it has become efficient, we know that our public hospitals are not the best. Why has it become like that in the first place? And it has been due to governments letting go of their core responsibilities of health or education or governance and outsourcing it to private sector. So for example, after 1980s and 90s, we saw the kind of opening of private sector hospitals like no other country had seen. So you also have to understand that with this kind of starvation of funds that our public sector services have been, how will they do it better? At the same time, we also have examples. We have other states which have done very well in terms of their public health services. So we have examples from Kerala, which has a very good public health system, and which invests in its public health schemes in terms of hiring, in terms of budgets, in terms of medicines, in terms of sub centers, etc. So so it is also important to ask that why is it like that? Why is it that the same state in our countries, be it Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Himachal Pradesh, have been able to do it better, but the other states have not been able to do it? And the other aspect about improving, we also have other countries. This is the example in our country. We've also had Nordic country. We have also other countries in Europe and UK, which spend and hire a much larger amount of people in their public services as a proportion of their given the size of their economy. So if UK has a smaller size of economy, their fraction of the kind of people they hire in public services is much higher than a country like India, which seems to be getting away from making any more public hirings or things like that. So yeah, that, I mean, the better trainings and better work ethics and decision making can always be done later, but I think we have to solve the structural problem of more investments, political will, and ensuring that we have a certain health rights or rights-based framework in place before questioning the public sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Deepika. I think
can I make a small response? Can I make a small
Jammu,
response?
we are running a bit out of time, but
okay.
I think if it's a broader point, you'll get half an hour later to add to what Deepika has already answered. And like she said, you were quite good in sort of responding to that question, but I think we should come back to that and we'll give you time later to add to that. Let's now move to the last speaker, who is Ranja Sengupta, who's an economist with the Third World Network. And Ranja, as we know, there are lots of national level initiatives to hold big tech companies accountable. In fact, the US recently had a congressional hearing which was very critical of the monopoly power that big tech enjoys now and called for regulations. In fact, even asked to break them up to stop the monopoly power that they have. And India is also creating these regulations. But I think your work is focused on what's happening at the international level, where there's an attempt by big tech corporations to create so-called e-commerce and digital trade rules, which will ensure that these attempts at domestic regulation do not stand in the way of them increasing market access and collecting data and doing what they want to do with it, which we heard from the health and urban local bodies sector from the last two speakers. So you've been following WTO, FTA negotiations for many years. So I would request you to elaborate on how these processes are going to lead to an expansion of the private sector and what are the challenges that groups like BSI should look out for. Ranja, please. You're on mute, Ranja. We can't hear you. Please unmute yourself. We still can't hear you. You're still on mute. I can see.
Can you hear now?
Now we can, yes. Now we can.
When I switch on, when I use the headphones, it somehow puts me on mute. Okay, sorry.
We can hear you clearly. We can hear you very clearly. Go ahead.
Okay.
Now we can hear, yeah.
Okay, so as Jammu and Deepika talked about very, very well right now is within India at the national level, how there are increasing tendencies for privatization and pushed in the name of digitalization. Basically, they are going more digital and the digital technology is generally in the hands of private players. But using that argument, I think even our governments are trying to withdraw from their obligations. And they are like even in water, in health, as Deepika talked about, they're actually trying to relax. They are saying, oh, we have no responsibility, and more of this private cost because of using this digital technology, they are now passing on to all of us. So you pay if you want to use these services, and that's the big danger. But what I will talk about is the trade issue, the global picture, as Benny said. Benny, and interestingly, what you said, in US, in many countries, we are now trying to also regulate these digital companies. US is regulating its own digital companies, and most of the digital companies of the world are actually based in the US. But interestingly, at the global level, they are pushing these corporations onto us. poorer developing countries, and basically they are regulating them at home, but then they are expecting them to make huge profits in our countries, in poor countries, you know. And that is the biggest hypocrisy, I think, of all. So I think for us, it is very important to understand this global picture, you know, for us together as a group. Why do these trade rules matter? Say you will ask me, you know, Amazon India is already there, Walmart is there, many companies are coming in. Are we still bothered about trade? I would say yes, because you know what's happening is for quite a few years now, they are now trying to push global trade rules on e-commerce. Now, in the name of e-commerce, you will see everything comes in. It's not just, you know, companies selling things across the border. It's all kinds of services. It's the control of data, which I know we discussed even in the last webinar. So it all links up. It basically means what it's trying to secure is more control and more profit for these giant digital corporations. So Benny, for me, my presentation in a way, it's not about even just privatization. You know, I mean, I will talk a bit about that, like public moving and giving space and making more space for private players, private companies. But it is this big and huge digital corporations. I mean, in the world, you know, of the top 20 companies, say if you look between 2009 and 2018, these tech companies, their market capitalization share, it was 16% in 2009. And in 2018, it's moved to 56%, followed by financial services companies. Also, many of them operate on digital technology. So the digital giants are moving and increasing their economic power very, very fast. Sorry, is anybody saying something? Benny? Yeah, okay, I'll just continue. Yeah, so basically, and these, as I said, most of these top digital firms are concentrated either in the US or in China. If you look at web traffic data, most of these companies are actually based in the US, and a lot of it is also in China. Now, why does international trade matter? Because as I said, these digital companies, they are already doing, you know, 29 trillion USD business. Huge e-commerce, global e-commerce value is 29 trillion US dollars. It's huge. But they are saying, oh, you know, we are the future. Please, we need more concessions. We need global rules. What they want to do is they want to enter each country, like a country like India, and they want to sell services. But it's not just services and goods, but it's not just as simple. I will just go through some of what they want, what are they demanding, and why that is dangerous, and why that is also going to push India, say, towards more privatization, with a risk for our manufacturing, our services, so access to very critical services, but also work. I mean, it could lead to massive job loss. So in the, you know, bilateral trade agreements, many of you may be following, India is busy signing these bilateral, also negotiating regional trade agreements, where a few countries sign these agreements. So globally, there are a lot of these bilateral regional agreements, and e-commerce is being pushed by many rich countries, US, Japan, EU, Canada, and many countries, okay, and China also. But in the WTO, now they want a big agreement on e-commerce. And what does it want to gain? It is basically no rules for big digital corporations. Basically, if you look at it, it's so interesting. WTO is supposed to lay down rules, but all the proposals will say that there should be no rules for these gigantic companies. There should be nobody coming in the way of their profits. So if you look at e-commerce, it's both goods and services. So, you know, some goods coming physically, right? Like if you look at goods, they will pay an import duty at the border, right? So suppose China wanted to sell me something, India will put up some tax at the border, which means Chinese products cannot enter so easily. Otherwise, they will push us out totally. And for services, we impose certain restrictions and regulations. Now, so basically, one thing they want, so Alibaba, they want that all online sale should become totally duty-free. So Alibaba, Amazon sitting in the US, Alibaba sitting in China, should be able to sell to Indian consumers. We will book it online and Indian government will get no revenue, no tax. So that's the first big push simply for physical online selling. But India does not allow it at the moment. So anybody, like if Alibaba had to sell to us, or if Amazon had to sell us sitting in the US, they would have to pay a border duty like all other goods will have to do. But you can imagine this is the first thing they're pushing. The moment you say, okay, all that can enter duty free, all trade, everything, all manufacturing products, even services will simply come in duty free. They will fully compete with all producers in India. They will push them out. So the workers in India will not be needed because now you will be getting things directly from the US. You'll be getting things directly from China. So this is the first big push. Then the second type of products are called ET products, electronic transmission products, or digitizable products. You know, increasingly books, even games, video, sounds, media, many of these things are increasingly can be simply downloaded from the internet. Earlier, you needed a physical book. Now, many of us haven't even seen a physical book in years because we are simply reading on the net. So those kind of products, now already every 2 years, they enjoy this duty-free status, and this is renewed at the WTO every 2 years. So the rich countries, they are the ones selling this, you know, and China also. So they said, okay, every 2 years, governments will agree that no tax on this. So the value of this, you know, transmission, this ET products trade is actually huge. It's $66 billion US, and our governments are not imposing any tax. They don't get any revenue from that. These are allowed to enter totally duty-free. And UNCTAD made an estimate of, you know, what the loss is from such type of trade. And for India, so they have made calculation for developing countries, global ones. And these products, these ET products, are sold mainly by developed countries, the rich countries. And developing countries, we will import. You may think, oh, hey, India is a big player. We are also doing, we are great in IT, we are doing digital products, etc. But frankly, I will give you the data. India has caters to only 1% of this market. China has 40%, US has 20% of this market. So basically we will be importing, and we will be importing even more and more. So the UNCTAD estimate shows India's imports will increase by 9%. So all these products which could be digitized. And you know, now more and more products, like they are finding everything can be digitized actually. Everything can just come in and can be downloaded through online, you know, like many things, services and goods. So for India, UNCTAD estimates the revenue loss will be $497 million US, which in crores, I just calculated it, comes to 3,182 crores. So that is the loss we are already facing, and we will continue to face, because what these companies are demanding is this 2-year thing, let it be forever. No government, Indian government will never ever impose a tax, a border tax on these digitizable products, these ET products, okay? And then the third type of product is, you have heard of 3D printer, right? Now you'll be horrified to know even a house is being made through a 3D printer. So the design can be sent to you via internet, say from the US. A digital company sitting in the US sends the design, soft copy, the program or whatever it is, and in India, it will be printed out. Can you imagine? So what the UNCTAD report says, within a few years, this 3D printing is increasing hugely and global. So in one country, the big countries, it is being designed, but they are being printed in developing countries. And so you can imagine, within a few years, we will not need to manufacture anything. Everything will be coming and will be printed here on 3D printing, right? So 3D printing, what UNCTAD is saying, can replace all non-agricultural goods import. So whatever, any industrial product that we are actually importing will now come in through the internet. And then what are these companies demanding at the WTO? No taxes. So government does not earn anything. They lose huge revenue. So I was simply looking at India's industrial imports. And then at the moment we impose a tax, say 7% to higher percent, etc. Average 7-8%. So I calculate 8% of our current industrial imports, and it comes to 261,000 crores. So that's what we will lose. Since everything will become online, will be printed either through 3D printer or will be coming in as ET goods or physical goods through Alibaba will be pushed. So very soon, our entire import, and this is going to rise massively from now what it is, right? Because they are getting huge market opportunities. It's because they know through the data what the consumers want. So they know how to tap the market. They know how to make profits. And very soon, all our imports, the government will not earn any tariff revenue. Why does it matter? First thing, this tariff revenue, if the government, you can hear, like India is also saying, hey, I don't have money. We forget COVID. We don't have money to fund public services anymore. So once they lose potential revenue, it is very clear they are actually, what are they cutting? They are cutting public services. They are cutting spending on education. They are cutting spending on health, water, even food, because you know the farm bills that the government passed, right? So what is behind it? The Food Corporation of India doesn't have fund anymore, and the government cannot subsidize. I mean, it's of course finally a political will question. They don't want to fund, but also they're saying we cannot fund. So any revenue loss, what they're doing is then they're saying, hey, farmers will now buy from private players. That is what is behind the current agricultural bills, that we don't want to subsidize anymore. We cannot fund it. We don't have revenue. Let private players get in, and private players, so government either on your face through laws or indirectly basically is pushing, they are withdrawing. It allows them to withdraw from providing these public services, and they withdrawing from that, which means the public services, public sector will get squeezed. And it's not just public services, it's also the PSUs. Government also supports production and all, right? So all those activities, because they are losing huge revenue, and if these trade rules go through, they will lose more revenue. So this will lead, and we would not directly think of this in terms of privatization. We know private digital companies and taking over, etc. But this is because of this revenue loss, more and more governments, and India also, they are actually cutting down on public activity and public services and public production. And that means jobs in public sector will be lost, heavily lost, okay? But you would ask, okay, we can also make profit if these trade rules come. Our companies can also sell. As I told you, India has currently 1% share, and the first movers have an advantage. So these big digital corporations who have the technology, they are sitting in Silicon Valley in the US, or they are sitting in China. They have massive advantage. In fact, China is the only developing country who has managed to hugely increase its market share. Otherwise, it would have been totally US based, or UK, Germany, and some other rich countries. So we actually cannot make profit like that. And as I was saying, what it means is after some time, everything we will be importing from digital big giants sitting somewhere else in the world, they'll be exporting to us duty free. They don't have to pay any tax in the border. And this will slowly start, so the rules that we had before, that, under WTO different agreements, we can impose a duty on agricultural imports, on industrial imports, on services, we put something. None of it will matter because everything will come in digitally, and that's tax free, right? So it will totally replace, it will totally push out not only public services and production, but all private services and production by domestic players. So no jobs anywhere, will be totally in the control of these digital corporations. Let me just talk about 2-3 more features of these trade agreements. So the first big issue is no taxes at the border. These things simply pushing to come in free. They will come in free, no border tax to the government. But the second thing, what are they asking for? One big element of these trade proposals, that the rich countries, they basically place these proposals, but they are to protect the interest of their big digital corporations. Remember, I said US is regulating these companies domestically, but pushing in WTO to get more profits for these companies, because they can tax them, they can make money, but they are going to fleece basically us in poorer countries. So one very important thing is, these companies are asking is no physical presence. What does it mean? Now we have Amazon India, right? Later on, there won't be any Amazon India. Amazon can sit in the US, capture the entire Indian market, no duties at the border, and no taxes. So I don't know if many of you know, India levied a 2% tax on the revenue of these e-commerce companies, only the foreign players, right? So if this goes through, these companies will not be sitting in India anymore. India cannot tax Amazon India, because Amazon India will not be there. It will only be Amazon US or Amazon UK, and you cannot tax them. They are not paying a border import duty. They are not paying you a tax. So one major thing is we have made a loss of potential tax revenue from this growing economic activity. Benny, did you say something?
No, please go ahead. It was just unintended.
I'll finish in a few 2-3 minutes. Maybe 3-4 minutes. Yeah. So one is we cannot tax them, because that's what they're pushing. They will not sit here, no physical presence. It also means we cannot regulate them. So if Amazon is sitting in US and doing something bad, stealing our data or something, Indian government is totally powerless. It simply cannot do anything. So you can see that this will have also a massive impact on, so we'll be dependent on these big private gigantic digital corporations sitting somewhere else. No taxes, no regulation, you can't tell them anything, and more business will be going to them. So basically this would mean that, again, when government taxes get squeezed, it totally makes them withdraw from their commitments to provide public services. This will be another pressure to cut down on public services and lead to more privatization and big gigantic corporations sitting in other countries providing those services and goods. The other thing they also want is a free flow of data. I'll not discuss it. I think we've discussed this often in many meetings in the last webinar also. They also want that data should flow freely. So Indian government cannot have access to data of Indians. It'll all be maybe sitting in servers in the US. So Indian government cannot even ask for that data. And you can understand that these things, like you cannot tax them, you cannot put an import duty on their products, you cannot regulate them, means it is free for gigantic private corporations, digital corporations. And the last point is investment. Now, we have Amazon India, etc. A lot of these digital companies have made investment in India, and a lot of FDI in e-commerce in India. I mean, most companies have some foreign capital. So they are a lot into business to consumer selling. But I think even in the last webinar, we were discussing how the component of business to government is increasing. And that is both domestically, that companies, Amazon India or whoever, if they are sitting here, they are now increasingly selling to government. And because of COVID, that has increased manifold. I mean, I couldn't find the data, but there are a lot of reports saying how governments are increasing their digital use, right? So everybody is using globally, like whole retail has changed. Everybody is doing online shopping. The governments are also using services and goods which are digitally procured. So governments, and what you guys discussed already, this push that even the UN, even the World Bank, they are pushing that, governments should go more digital and they should procure from these global digital corporations. So they will use technologies provided by these big corporations. Again, a push towards big private players. And one very important thing which I found from the PSI report, which was great actually, it says that, the idea that many of you were asking that, if it gets digitized, quality of services will improve. But how that report finds, the PSI report finds, it doesn't improve on its own. It improves only with regulation. And what did I tell you? If the trade rules go through, our government will not be able to regulate these people. They'll be sitting in China, they'll be sitting in US, they'll be sitting in UK and Germany. We cannot regulate. So there is no way.
Ranja, if I can, sorry,
Yeah.
Ranja, if I can request you to
So
wrap up.
basically, just to sum, trade rules will be leading to increasing big, gigantic privatization, direct inroads of large digital MNCs, but also because they'll be squeezing government revenues and therefore government activity. And finally, they are making inroads into government market, right? They are actually approaching government, but they cannot be regulated. We cannot control them. But at the same time, they will increase this contractual work, self-employed work, and they will be cutting down a lot of jobs in the government sector. So yeah, thanks a lot. Sorry if I.
No, that's fine, Ranja. I'm sure you'll get a bit more time when we open it up for.
No, I'm done.
Discussions.
Thanks.
But just to underline, I think the main point that you made was to link the agenda of big tech in trade negotiations, which will lead to import sort of dependence in an economy like India, linked deindustrialization that will happen, and with the agenda on no duties, a massive loss of tax revenues, and then linked to the point that I think Deepika also made, that a lot of public money is going into governments paying out these big tech for services that are being provided by them. So whatever money is available with the government is being paid to insurance firms, big tech firms to control data. So the digital health mission, the contracts will go to big tech. So whatever public money is there is not going into investing in public health or better, hiring of workers and better work conditions, but it's being paid out. So we ending up with a double whammy of not just loss of revenues, but whatever revenues are there is being paid to big tech. So let's get some clarificatory questions to Ranja, and then we can sort of open it up. We don't have too much time. I will request maybe an extension of 10-15 minutes, but let's quickly get some responses to Ranja's inputs. I think people are still digesting all.
I know it's a lot to take in one go.
There is a hand up, Godsen.
Can your brother Godsen please ask your
question? Yeah.
Please
good
introduce
evening.
yourself. Please introduce yourself also.
Yeah, my name is Godsen. I work in PSI Chennai. So Ms. Ranjita was telling about the linkages of World Bank and MNC. So we are working on a role of IFIs in promoting privatization in South Asia. Are there any examples, more examples of IFIs directly promoting MNCs to further digitalization in India?
I also have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead. And maybe Ranja can answer it in sort of a bunch if there are any more, please.
Ranja, you mentioned how the digital trade rules make that companies have less commitments to paying taxes. And in the news recently also the case of Vodafone came up, how Vodafone won a case against India in an international tribunal. So can you speak a bit about that also? If you can give a bit of a short summary of the case and what we should look out for in that regard.
Thanks, Susanna. And
hold on, Ranja. Let's just see if there's any more questions.
Okay, yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, I think we can get you to respond.
I mean, I think even ADB and many of these World Bank definitely are asking governments to use more digital services and products. And that is a very dangerous tendency. And the PSI report, I will urge you to look at the PSI report, because that actually highlights how even the UN, I mean, you are talking about IFIs and we don't trust the IFIs, right? I mean, they are bad anyway. I mean, we expect the World Bank to make recommendations like this. Even the ADB has been making recommendations like this as well. But even the UN, I mean, UN is pushing. And if you follow a lot of discussions at the UN, how they praise these big digital corporations it's kind of astonishing, actually, without talking about their control and their very exploitative profit making. So yeah, I mean, I think I don't know of so many, but I think if we look at IMF recommendations, etc., we will see the same pattern, that governments, especially as a solution to COVID, governments are being asked to go more digital and actually take services from the global companies. I mean, it's not like they are always being told that take it from your small digital companies, your digital SMEs who are coming up, but it's more pushing for the big digital corporations. To answer Susanna's question on the investment, I had no time to discuss that because there are the investment treaties. These are called bilateral investment treaties. So India had also signed 82 and we signed. So with many countries, there are now over, I think globally about 3,500 such treaties signed between two countries, which says that India has signed with the UK. So if a UK company comes and makes some investment in India, then if we have an investment treaty, if UK and India has an investment treaty, India has to protect the right of that UK company. And what does it say? That you cannot do one big thing they do is you cannot do physical, it's called expropriation. For example, if government wants to build a road, they can actually take over the house of any company. They can take over the factory, right? So even for foreign companies, they can do that, which is physical expropriation. But what's the big thing in these investment treaties? That the government, even if it changes a policy, so what the case that Susanna was talking about, government changed its tax laws and with retrospective effect, it could impose a tax on these transfers, because Vodafone bought Hutch, which used to operate in India. So the government would have got a tax from that capital transaction. But because the policy came later, they challenged it. So any policy change by the government which reduces the profit of this foreign company can also be challenged in secret. They are not going to go to the public. Nobody gets to know about them. They will not go to domestic courts. They will go to international arbitration tribunals and they'll be totally secret. And the companies are now suing for huge amounts all over the world. And this is a major problem for workers. So in Egypt, when Egypt tried to come up with Minimum Wages Act, they were trying to, raise the level of minimum wages by law. And this French company called Veolia sued them because they said, now if we have to pay higher wages, our profits will go down. Can you imagine? In many cases, even the company itself is doing environmental pollution. When the government tries to take steps against them, they say, hey, you are reducing my profit. Because these investment treaties, the only thing they understand is that the foreign investor is like God. His profit is sacrosanct, his or her, and that cannot be touched. So these investment treaties are another big problem in the global trade and investment policy framework because they are allowing huge power to the foreign corporations. So now very soon we will see digital companies. China. A lot of companies are apparently moving out of China. They're coming to India. A lot of governments, UP, Gujarat, they are rushing to downgrade labor laws so that they can attract this foreign investment. But once these labor laws are downgraded, it is a danger because you can imagine we cannot raise the standard anymore. So we were fighting for rights of platform economy workers and so on. If we don't do it now, later if you try to do it, these companies will sue. So that's another dimension. These foreign investors have huge rights. Their profits cannot be touched. So labor policy, public health policy, environment policy, everything they can challenge. And the government has to pay them huge compensation. And that compensation will again reduce public services because it comes out of the same government revenues, right? So there are different pressures on government revenue because of these global trade and investment commitments. And that means there is perennial pressure to downsize public services, which means perennial pressure to cut jobs in public services. And this is some aspect we often don't realize, that through trade, just through cutting government revenue, huge impact on public services. So that's something we really need to note and fight.
Thank you, Ranja. We are running out of time, but I would maybe request any last set of questions.
Yes, I am Narasimhan,
please,
General
Narasimhan,
Secretary, All India National Life Insurance Employees Federation. I would like to make a very short intervention. I know we are running short of time. We have discussed digitalization, trade, the loss to the government, but ultimately digitalization is nothing but financial expansionism by the powerful countries through these multinational corporations. They are doing this in the garb of business, trade, service, by whatever name you call it. This leads to shortage of revenue or income to the governments, which has a direct impact on the public spending and the health of the public sector. And this leads to informalization, contractorization, which again affects the service being provided by the public sector. The same deficiency in service is being shown as a reason to privatize the public sector. So this is a larger game plan to bring the public services into private sector. But I would like to say, in the last financial crisis, India was mostly unscathed by it only because of a strong public sector. So strong public sector will always lead to good financial health and also better services to the people. Hence, digitalization by the governments is okay, but digitalization being done, being handed over to private companies along with data, it's a huge risk, not only for the public services, but also to the financial integrity of the country and also the security of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Narasimhan. I mean, there was not a question so much, but I think just a comment contextualizing the rise of digital corporations within a political economy context and underlining the critical role of the public sector in the financial integrity of the country. Do we have any more questions? If we don't, I think we should wrap up. I'm going to request if Deepika or Ranja have any closing comments, because Brother Jammu has left for another meeting. So if I can give you a minute to just make some concluding thoughts, and then we can close the meeting. Ranja, you can go first.
Just quickly, yes. So for me, I will urge you all to watch the trade space, because for many of you, what is happening here on the ground is very urgent. You see that as the main challenge. But there is this big, huge global design. You know, these big corporations, they are pushing not only within India, they are pushing in the WTO, they are pushing in the trade agreements. And it's very important to understand those linkages. And it's not always clear. One is they'll directly come and sell everything. They will totally push out domestic services, domestic manufacturing, and public services, right? Your jobs will go with that. But this whole big revenue thing is something just because of revenue loss, our governments in any case will cut down on their activities, which is again a massive problem, both for access to services, because I think all of you who work in public services, you don't work there only just for jobs. You know that it's a very important thing for citizens, right? You work in health sector because you know health is important. You know, you work in public water services because you know that water supply is very important for, for our citizens. So it is on the one side an access issue, because all these big companies, when they give you services, it will be free initially, then they'll raise prices. So I think along with understanding your everyday challenges, it's very important to understand what is happening to this big politics globally. I think that is crucial. Unfortunately, it's complicated, but we have to watch that, because digitalization is the thing which is most easily globalized. It is by nature a global product, right? So it will move across the globe, and global players will decide what happens to you and me.
Thanks, Ranja. Deepika, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, not much, Benny, but I can see so many commonalities across all the three, what all the three speakers said, and even the comments that were made by us. And like if you look from the top, like when you go back and have an overview, you basically see how there's a larger certain political systems and ideology at play. So yeah, I think we need to be like really careful, keep monitoring, like Ranjana said, and also continue to negotiate our spaces. Yes, and also definitely, because a lot of time these things become very complicated, and it's very difficult to explain its consequences on general people. People wouldn't really understand how can digitization of health has to do anything with my health or my access to health services. So yeah, that's other thing, the importance of really reaching out to people in as simple a language in terms of explaining the threats that such plans play. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Deepika. I think, yeah, we need to keep this dialogue going. It's a fast expanding phenomenon, the sort of rise of big tech, and we've seen it expanding in breakneck speed, especially during the pandemic. There are some resources already out there. Ranja pointed to some excellent studies by PSI, and we need to make them more popular. But just to conclude, I think it's hard to understate the challenge of digitization, especially in terms of the way that Ranja put it out, in terms of the implications for public revenues, for taxation policy, for India's industrial policy, for the future of public services. And I think all the three speakers highlighted, sort of different aspects of the challenge, but also showed how it was interconnected and it overlaps in terms of how this government's domestic agenda of disempowering local governments, disempowering state governments, centralization, but using that power to privilege the rise of big tech. And all of us need to, closely monitor this space, create united platforms, and look at also the public interest role of technology and data. And if the governments have a vision, which they don't have, like Deepika articulated, it becomes completely controlled by private corporations. So we can have an alternative public interest agenda on technology as well, looking at how it can advance efficiency within public sector employees. I think a question that was raised as well. So thank you everyone very much. We will conclude this webinar now, but just to announce that in a week from now, on 18th October, which is Sunday at the same time, 3:30, we will have another webinar which looks at data and the impacts of big data and the role of tech companies in undermining workers' rights. But I'm hoping there also we can articulate a positive agenda in terms of using data in the public interest as well. So thank you everyone for joining us on this Saturday afternoon.